Risk assessments for dealing with COVID-19. The CORGI way. Risk assessments in dwellings. All you need to know to keep you, your company, your employees and your customers safe during COVID-19. What is a risk assessment and why is it important? It is thinking about what might cause harm to people and to decide whether you are taking reasonable steps to prevent that harm. This is a risk assessment and it is something you're required to carry out by law. Just because it is the law, it doesn't mean it has to be lots of writing and paperwork. The main thing is to think through what you need to do and write some simple documentation. The law says if your company is under 5 people, you don't have to write the risk assessment down. But how much better do you think your employees and your customers are going to feel if they can see that you've taken the trouble to write it down and share it? It might not be the law, but it's a great trust builder. How do you carry out a risk assessment? Employers have a duty to consult their people on health and safety and appoint a representative. But more importantly, your team will have great ideas to contribute. You can do this by talking to them about the work and how you will manage risks from COVID-19. There are 5 steps to carrying out a risk assessment. Step 1. Identify hazards. In other words, anything that may cause harm. Employers have a duty to assess the health and safety risks faced by their workers. Employers must systematically check for possible physical, mental, chemical and biological hazards. Step 2. Decide who may be harmed and how. Identifying who is at risk starts with your organization's own full and part-time employees. Employers must review work routines in all the different locations and situations where their staff are employed. Step 3. Assess the risks and take action. Employers must consider how likely it is that each hazard could cause harm. This will determine whether or not you should reduce the level of risk. Even after all the precautions have been taken, some risk usually remains. You must decide for each remaining hazard whether the risk remains high, medium or low. Step 4. Make a record of the findings. This record should include details of any hazards noted in the risk assessment and action taken to reduce or eliminate risk. This record provides proof that the assessment was carried out and it is used as the basis for a later review of working practices. The risk assessment is a working document. You should be able to read it. It should not be locked away in a cupboard. Step 5. Review the risk assessment. A risk assessment must be kept under review in order to ensure that agreed safe working practices continue to be applied, take account of any new working practices, new machinery, or more demanding work targets. They are the steps, but what does a risk assessment look like? Well, first, let's look at a risk matrix. This might help to give you a better idea of how to assess risk, both in your business and your customer's home. Risk matrix. Risk equals likelihood multiplied by severity. In this grid, you can see on the left-hand side, we have likelihood measured as either highly unlikely, unlikely, and likely, given scores of 1, 2, and 3. And across the top, we have severity or consequence. These are graded slightly harmful, harmful, or extremely harmful, and again given scores of 1, 2, and 3. So in an example, we could say that there's a highly likely chance of the risk occurring, and it could be harmful. So we would multiply the scores of 3 and 2 together to give us a score of 6, and that would be classified as substantial risk. As we have seen, the risk matrix shows how to rate a risk. We can now look at a risk assessment and see how we can use the matrix to minimize the risks. Do you need a risk assessment for each property? Consider a risk assessment form for each property you visit so you have a record for each one. Use your own standard risk assessment form and then adapt it to the property and customer being visited. Use a pre-visit phone call with the customer to advise them of how to manage the risks to them and assess if you need to adapt the standard form. This is the risk assessment template for working in people's homes. In this example, you can see we're recording the company name, who carried out the assessment, when the next review is taking place, the date the assessment was carried out, and you could see in the notes that we've reminded ourselves of what risk equals, which is likelihood multiplied by severity. We then have a series of headings, and in this example, we're looking at the hazard of social distancing and the impact it might have on employees and customers. So what does each heading mean? Firstly, what are the hazards? Think about what hazards you, your employees and customers could experience before, during and after the visit. Spend time thinking through all the stages of the job and list out areas that you think could be a hazard. You may not identify them all up first time round, but input from your team and customers will help to make them better as you use the risk assessment. Examples of hazards: social distancing, self-isolation, person at increased risk, person defined on medical grounds as extremely vulnerable, living with a person in one of the above groups, if someone falls ill, travel to work, driving to work, hand washing, touching handles in customers' premises, toilet facilities. Who might be harmed and how? Here you need to list out people who are going to be impacted by the hazard. You might want to consider the number of people impacted, as that could change how you see the risk and the measures you have put in place. How are those at risk from the hazard impacted? Again, this will impact on the measures you put in. What are you already doing to control the risk? Write down here what you're currently doing or planning to do to manage the risk. Risk matrix. Now you have detailed the risk, use the risk matrix to assess it. Be as objective as you can for a subjective assessment. Record the numbers in the columns and then calculate the risk, which is likelihood multiplied by severity. You can leave this as a number or colour it in, as our previous example. What further action could you take to control the risks? Having done the risk rating, consider if you have taken all reasonable steps to reduce the risk, and write here if you could do more. Use the risk matrix to assess the risk again. Anything rated a 6 or a 9, orange or red zones, should be looked at in particular. Decide if you're going to carry out the extra steps. Who needs to carry out the action? Decide on the people who need to be carrying out the action. It can be more than one person and can also include your customer. When is the action needed by? You can record here what is needed by those responsible. You can then sign it off as done when the item has been completed.